So let's take a look at how we can use Playmaker to enhance the user experience on our island. So in this demonstration, we'll set up a basic health system. And the idea is that we'll pick up a collectible and ultimately we'll add that to our health or possibly points or some kind of currency system that we can then manage as a resource while exploring our island. Ultimately, we can introduce some points of danger and complement that with the ability to regenerate some health, and that'll give us our basic gameplay mechanic. So to get this demonstration started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate just a simple cube just to get kind of a proof of concept up and running. And I'm going to place this close to the ground so that my first person controller can run into this object. So right out of the box, when we introduce a simple game object with geometry inside Unity, you'll notice that it comes with this collider on it, which means that we can bump into it, we can jump on top of it, and if we take a look at the object, if we select the object and look at it through the inspector, you'll notice that it has a box collider. So each piece of geometry that we generate inside Unity gives us this box collider, and that allows our player to interact with these objects. Now we want to take advantage of that with Playmaker, and what we'll do is we'll set up a scenario where we can run into this object and destroy it, effectively picking it up and collecting it. So to get this started, what I'll do is make sure that I have the cube selected, and in the Playmaker editor window I'll right click and choose to add an FSM. Now once I add the FSM, I want to make sure that state 1 is selected. And this time I'm going to start naming my states a little bit different so that when I go back and look at these states, I have a pretty clear idea of what they're doing. State 1, I'll call this either wait or waiting or idle. I like to use idle to suggest that there's not much happening with this and it's waiting for some user interaction. So we'll call this idle. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look inside the physics category. Anytime that we want to interact by running into an object or triggering an object's collider, we want to look inside the physics category inside the action browser of Playmaker. And if I look in here, there's a trigger event. Now there's a couple of different ways to interact with game objects inside Unity. There's a collision event, but in this case we want a trigger event. We don't actually want to collide with the object, we just want to cross into its collider, its box collider, and cause it to pick up, or in this case we're going to have the object destroy itself. So to this first state that says idle, I'm going to double click and add a trigger. Now in order to get this trigger to work, there's a couple things that I need to do. The first thing I need to do is you can see here that on trigger enter is the first action. There's a couple of different actions when it comes to triggers. We could on trigger enter, stay, or exit, and they all have a slightly different meaning. On enter just means that when we first interact or cross the threshold of the box collider, it's going to trigger whatever event that we have. Now currently we're going to leave this collide tag to untagged, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a short bit. The send event, once we collide with this object, we want to be able to send it off to another state. So we're requiring a send event here, and if I click on the drop down menu you can see that I don't have any that are established yet. So that's a good indicator that I need to go over to the events tab and create a custom event. Now I'll simply call this, maybe I'll call it picked up or collided with, or this is really just kind of a user-friendly name that you come up with that you use to kind of separate the different transition events. So I'll just call this picked up for now. So now I have that event after I type in the name and hit the add button or hit return. I'm going to go back to my state and I'm going to select that new event that I created. And the minute that I do that, Playmaker does a pretty good job of warning me that there's still another step that I have to take, which in this case it's telling me that the event is not used by the state that I've created. And I get a little exclamation point on here. And that tells me that I just need to right click and add it as a transition. Because remember, the goal is to transition from one state to another based on some kind of a condition. And in this action that we're creating, the condition that we want to be listening for is a trigger event. In other words, I want my first person controller to run into this object and cause a trigger event to happen. And when that happens, I'm going to create another state and transition the picked up event over to the next state. Now, So the logic here is that we're sitting, our game object is idling, waiting for a trigger event, and when that trigger event happens, we want to get rid of this object in our scene. And the easy way to do that, I'll select this new state, and I'll go into Game Objects, and from the Game Objects category of the Action Browser, I can choose to destroy self. I'll double click and add that, and so the logic here is that on state 1, it's going to stay in state 1 until it encounters this trigger event, and currently that's going to be the player character colliding with the object. When that happens, it's going to trigger this send event, which is called picked up. That'll send it to state 1, and on state 1, I'll just call this just destroy self. So just by looking at this state machine and these different states, I get a pretty clear sense of what the functionality of the state is. I can see that it's idling, it's waiting to be picked up. When it gets picked up, it's going to destroy itself. So now there's just one other thing that I need to do, and that is if I go back to my idle state and I look at the trigger event, the trigger event is a special kind of event that's conducted by the box collider of this object. And in order for it to work, we need to go into the inspector and focus on the box collider of this cube and check this little box that says is trigger. We want to make sure that the box collider acts as a trigger because we're listening for a trigger event. So if we leave this unchecked, this is not going to work. So I'll make sure it's checked. I'm going to hit the play button and I'll give this a quick test to make sure that everything works. So I'm going to walk over, I'm going to pass through the object, and when I look back, or even when I pass into it, you can see that the object's gone. In addition to that, if I look in the hierarchy, I can tell that my cube is gone as well. In addition to that, if I look down in the Playmaker editor window, I can see that the entire FSM, so I have a lot of good indicators that that cube is disappearing. So I'll test it one more time, and this time, oops, let me back out of this. I'll select the cube, I'll hit the play button, and I'll notice down in my Playmaker editor that I'm currently stuck in the idle state. And again, I'm listening for a trigger event, and so now when I pass through this object, I can see that it disappears. So I'm effectively picking up this object. It's a resource that I'm running into. I'm picking it up, and depending on whether this is a good object or a bad object, we could, have it add health. We could have it add some kind of points or other resource that we're trying to manage, or this could provide some damage to us as well. So we can use this mechanism or this mechanic in a lot of different ways. So I'm going to toggle my play button off, and I'm just going to look at one more thing. I have an issue here, which is that currently this trigger event is listening for anything that collides with it. So in the event that we end up building in our game, we have some kind of projectile that we're shooting, or we're throwing things around, or maybe we have some bad guys chasing us around the island. In the event that they interact with this cube, they could trigger the event as well. And just as a demonstration of that, what I'll do is I'll just create a real simple game object here. I'll take a sphere and I'll just move this up just a little bit, and I'll go to Components, Physics, and I'll add a rigid body. And so that should just drop right on that cube. And I'll hit the play button, and if I can look at my cube quick enough, there we go, I can see that that sphere triggered that object as well. Now that may or may not be what I want. And there's a way to control what kind of objects trigger this event. And I'll just go back into my idle tab, my idle state, and I'll draw your attention to this collide tag. And currently, this collider tag is set to untagged. Now, there's a tag system inside Unity, and this can be very valuable for a lot of different reasons. In this case, we're going to use it to kind of filter out physics collisions, or trigger events in this case, with very specific objects. So we could set this to collide with a specific tag that we create. Now, if I look up here in the top of my inspector, you can see that there's a tag menu. Okay, and I currently have my cube selected, so I'm going to go select my first person controller, and I'm going to go look and see what it's tagged with. And currently, by default, it's tagged with an untagged, an untagged tag inside Unity. Now you'll look, if you click on that drop-down menu, you'll see that there's a lot of pre-configured tags, and in fact we can create our own tags and filter based on those. But there is a pre-configured tag called player, and I'll just select that. So this comes as the default with a Unity scene, and I'll just borrow that tag. And so currently my first-person controller is tagged with player. So now if I hit the play button and I run over to this cube, you'll see that I got to move my sphere out of the way just a little bit. Move that over, hit the play button, and I should be able to run over and run into this cube. Now, you'll notice that I passed right through the cube, but I'm not triggering that action. And the reason for that is that currently my first-person controller is set to player. The tag is set to player. And if I go into the cube and I select the first state of my state machine, it's listening for a trigger event that's triggered by an object that's tagged with the untagged tag. Okay, and if I click on the drop-down menu, you'll see that the same tags that were available in the drop-down menu for the first-person controller are also available here. So any tag that's active inside Unity, we can choose. And in this case, we want to select player. And now that should filter out any collisions that may happen with anything other than the player. So I'll just try to line my sphere back up here. That looks like it should fall. I'll hit the play button. And you can see that the sphere no longer triggered that pickup script or that collision or trigger event, but when I pass my character through that object, it does pick it up. So there's a lot of things that you can do with that, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we can tag and control the kinds of interactions that we're having. So experiment with that. We'll add another layer on top of it and start to translate that into some kind of a health or currency variable, and we'll use this as our basic mechanic for picking things up around our island. We'll catch up in the next presentation.